Well, hello, everybody. It's Peter May here from the wilds of Eastern Long Island in New York. Not exactly where I've been living most of the past 30 years, which has been in Brazil. But this is a good opportunity to settle back and try to think a bit about what we've been doing over these years, looking at the different kinds of programs that have been developed by Brazilian authorities as well as other nations to try to stave off the problems of deforestation and to incorporate the true values of natural resources, natural capital in the development of policies. So it's a great opportunity for me to get together with you all, whoever's there, to go over some of the thoughts that we presented during this module, in which we discussed a series of themes that have been the focus of work in ecological economics, which is my main flag waving that I've been involved in over the past 25 years or so, to try to value the costs and benefits of improving and maintaining natural capital for today and for the future. And we also discussed some of the issues related to the costs of not doing things right as regards to ecosystem services and biodiversity, and the costs of management of forests under certification as being one appropriate way of getting into more suitable approaches to maintaining the forest as a productive source of income and services for society. So I'm open to receiving some of your questions. I believe there are a couple of questions that have already been posed online in the group chat. And if you have any other questions as we go along here today, please post them, and we'll try to get around to them as soon as we can during the 1 hour we have together. I am taking a look now at the questions that were posed online. We have one from Mahmoud Yeka, how to estimate the economics of terrestrial ecosystems and the cost of policy action in qualitative, quantitative, and monetary terms, considering the presentation that I made for you on the cost of policy inaction. Well, Mahmoud and the rest, this has been the approach that has been adopted since the Stern report, which was the huge study that was conducted by the British government involving Lord Stern, Nicholas Stern, who was a former chief economist of the World Bank, and then went back to work for the Exchequer in the UK to look at the question of what would happen if we didn't act in time to forestall the impacts of climate change on society. What would be the cost of not having as much productivity in agriculture, of having sea level rise and increased incidence of serious climate incidents affecting people in all walks of life. And that approach was very effective in alerting policymakers to the need to turn things around and act, so that in fact the idea of looking at policy in action and what kind of costs might be associated with that is very compelling. Now, obviously, there's an inverse side of the coin when you have to look at what the costs of action are. What we have seen, though, in the case of climate action, for example, is that in many countries, the costs of implementing innovations in particularly technical innovations, fairly simple ones in many cases, may end up being win-win solutions and not be a cost. and the long run. You may have a cost at the outset when you have to invest heavily in, say, changing from a grid based on purely fossil fuels and moving to photovoltaics or wind power or water wheels or whatever, and that obviously will be a significant hit at the outset. But in the long run, if you look at things over, say, the century that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has been estimating the impacts of climate change on society, uh, and bring those benefits over the long term of having acted and changed your grid to a more renewable base, the benefits will flow in net present value terms, will be much larger if we act now than if we wait, say, 20 years to when things are really going to get tough. Because as you may know, the IPCC has predicted that we're going to really see significant rise in terrestrial temperatures as of 2050 and beyond, and perhaps not so serious until then. So when we're looking at, for example, the costs of investing in changing land use in the Amazon, which is what we've talked a lot about in this course, we look at the costs of avoiding deforestation as being related to the costs of having to pay people not to take down the forest, not to invest in other activities. And in order to do that, frequently the kinds of analysis that are used to get at the costs is to look at what people are making off of the land as they degrade it and convert it into pasture or convert it into soybeans or something like that. Pastures, which are by the far the most significant source of deforestation in the Amazon, not so much in Africa or in Indonesia, where you have palm plantations going in, and in Africa, lots of timber exploitation and maybe smallholder kinds of agriculture. In the Amazon, it's kind of big ranches. That's the big problem. So what do you need to compensate a livestock operation to not increase the area under pasture? That is the big question that is usually raised. So that is the cost of action in terms of reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation of forests that is principally applied. It's an opportunity cost, as it's frequently called. And in many cases, particularly in the areas that are further into the Amazon from the highways and other transport corridors, to roads and railroads and waterways, it's not very lucrative to open up lots of new areas to pasture production. In fact, it may be negative. So that by introducing more intensive uses of land, managing pastures more rationally in rotation, including trees in agroforestry systems that you're going to be studying now in Module 4 with Rita Mesquita, you will have a much better return on your investment than continuing to cut down the forest at the forest fringe and going further into the pristine forest, and that will be beneficial not only for you, because you'll have a more lucrative and more productive unit of land in terms of the cattle productivity on your land, but you also be reducing the carbon footprint of your activity on others, the rest of the world. So there are some very interesting win-win solutions that may be possible to promote through incentives, payments, credit systems, you name it. We've talked a lot in this course about payment for ecosystem services, and this is one area in which people think about, well, you should really be thinking about using payments for ecosystem services to try to promote this kind of activity, to intensify land use and intensify production practices in livestock and in other areas that are too extensive in their use of land. So I think that is one good example that could be very useful for understanding better what the costs of policy action would be in order to promote the terrestrial benefits that we're looking for. The second question that I received by email or that was already posted on the site, I'm not sure who this came from, but what are the incentives for a timber producer to seek certification without the guarantee that it will secure it at a higher market price? Well, that's the real kicker also when we talk about certification. Very few of the certified timber operations are able to secure a price premium when they take the product to market. This happens because there are quite a lot of people who have moved into certification, and they're competing with each other too. So they're competing against non-certified wood. But in fact, what happens in a lot of cases, as I mentioned during the class, a lot of people who are getting into certification for, say, tropical timbers are doing it because there's no market for tropical timbers outside of Brazil or Indonesia or wherever, unless you're certified. If you want to export timber, precious woods, quality hardwoods from the Amazon to Europe or the United States, you're not going to get Home Depot to interest get at all in buying what you have to offer if you don't have an FSC label on that wood. They're just going to say, no, sorry, stay in Brazil. Look for a cheapo construction operation to buy your wood to make forms for concrete instead of selling it to make fancy hardwood furniture here in the north. So that's a really important consideration. Obviously, it's not the price premium for versus in the same market looking at certified versus non-certified. Just there's no non-certified wood being sold in most of the north anymore. Now, if you want to export your wood to China or another developing country, you probably would have less problems because they are not yet up to speed in terms of restricting access to the market to those woods that are certified. So this is a real consideration, a real constraint for many people who are in the business. We worked in Mato Grosso with a very advanced wood door manufacturer named Road Lignia, and they went through the whole process of FSC certification, and it was a major expense for them to do so. But when it came down to the shove, they had a number of costs that restricted their access to markets that would have been more lucrative, and they ended up having to sell in the national market, and that was not a good solution for them. So it can be quite a significant difference when you're looking at the possibility of actual access to market barriers that may or not be publicly imposed. The actual buyers of tropical timbers are the ones who are specifying the origin. They want to specify the production practice that the timbers have been produced under. They want to be able to trace from the origin to final consumer, and they're not just open to taking anything that comes around. So I think that this is probably the the major impact that certification has had on the timber industry. And the big problem in Brazil is that we're pretty much saturated the foreign market certified timber market from Brazil is all the certified wood is going outside of Brazil. So that in Brazil, the attempts to improve the quality of timber management in natural forests has not been very successful, because it's very difficult within Brazil to create a segmented market where you have such cheap wood being sold. Like 80% of Brazilian timbers are going to Sao Paulo and other states, basically to be used for cheap applications or construction, rather than being used for high-end market products. So although there was an attempt to create a buyer's market for certified timbers, this is pretty much fallen apart, because all of the certified wood is basically going out of Brazil looking for better deals overseas, and there isn't enough to supply the national market, even if they were intent upon buying certified wood. And the competition with non-certified wood is so fierce that they're being undercut at every turn. So it's a long road to getting to a native timber-based economy for timber in countries where you have large volumes of illegally extracted timber, uncertified and unmanaged, being sold under the counter, as it were. Although in a place like Brazil, things are pretty much over the counter, and nobody's complaining about it. So those are significant issues dealing with the certification industry. Let's see if we have any other questions. I don't see anything else coming up here. Yeah, here's a good question. What do you think would be an ideal format or scenario where the costs of externalities and negative impacts be incorporated in the private sector? How can we avoid having them simply transferred to consumers instead of companies taking them into consideration and changing the production process? Well, that's another kicker. The whole issue of externalities that we've discussed from the very first day of our lectures on this in the course is that these costs are not being taken into consideration by those producers who are not regulated effectively to change production practices to ensure the consumer of a quality product that meets both environmental, social, and economic characteristics that are not sustainable. And that is a question for regulation. Now, there's obviously been at the same time a movement on the part of more advanced industries and businesses in general to try to find ways forward toward a more responsible, both socially and environmentally, corporate image and a corporate practice. So you have a significant effort on the part of organizations like the Natural Capital Coalition, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and other national and international bodies, including the finance industry, to pressure industries to move in that direction of actually absorbing the externalities in their production process, and then being able therefore to market their products on a sustainable footing. Now, whether they're going to pass these costs on to consumers is a big question. Obviously, in the first phase of innovation towards sustainable enterprise, there is a search for higher end markets, like the certification market that I described for timbers, where you're looking for niches in the in the market that will pay better and will compensate for the additional costs that may be necessary, or at least the innovation costs that are necessary to get off of the track that one was on before and get into a more sustainable footing. At least, part of your enterprise being certified, or part going into a, like the Natura, the cosmetics business did. They put 10% of their product line into the Ecos line, which is all based on natural sourcing of cosmetics base materials like babasu oil derived from the Eastern Amazon, or urucum, or copaiba, some of these interesting flavors and varieties that can be had from the Amazon. Then they were able to market these things in Paris in a very fancy shop and ask hundreds for it. But not all firms could do that, there isn't that huge demand. It's a small sliver of the market that's going to be willing to pay more for these high quality niche market products. So the ideal is that the consumer perceives an interest in sustainable products, but that the prices do not reflect costs of innovation and sustainable sourcing and process innovation that go into having these kind of differentials. And then you can more broadly provide this kind of product base to society as a whole, and a consumer, by being a responsible consumer, is able to access at a reasonable cost those goods which are being provided on a sustainable basis. We're still, I think, in the very beginning of making this happen on a large scale basis, but there has been changes. You go to a supermarket in the United States these days, half of the products either say they're organic, or say they're sustainably sourced, or they say that they're non-GMO, or they say they're derived in some way from non-genetically modified animal products, etc. And that is all happening because the consumer is demanding it. It's not happening because the company is being nice, trying to be a good guy. It's because they realize that their market competitiveness depends on their showing that they are able to produce things in a sustainable way. And it has to go beyond labeling. It has to enable people to actually reflect the quality of their enterprise in a suitable way, with adequate information on the cereal box or whatever to the consumer, so that they realize that what they're buying is not just greenwash, but it's something that really makes a difference for nature and for human welfare. So I think there was something else coming up here. Yeah, well, I don't see any more questions. It was just really interesting that to be able to discuss some of these issues with you. What I don't see questions about, although I think there was one that was posted by Armando, who is one of our colleagues in ecological economics in Brazil, that I don't see being reproduced here. But if I remember right, he was concerned about the use of payments for ecosystem services as being an appropriate mechanism for bringing about change towards sustainable development. We did have a session on payments for ecosystem services, so I think that would be something that we should really delve into. Mariana, do you know where that is? I'm not sure where that full question ended up. I have let's see, I'm opening up the course chat and seeing if I can find.
Sorry, Peter, what was the question you were referring to?
came from Armando in Brasilia.
The
Pretty sure.
discussion forum?
Was that?
He sent on the discussion forum?
Yeah, it was. I think it was on the chat session, on the chat list during the
Right.
sessions,
I
but I'm
think I
not
just
sure.
found it. I'll post it for you on
Oh,
the chat.
okay. A lot of interesting stuff here, actually. There it is. Is PS strategy effective to combat deforestation due to real estate speculation? If not, what alternative strategies have been effective? Well, that's in general. I mean, there's a lot of good issues here. He's talking about the Cerrado area of Brazil and the cost of land having increased significantly. We're not talking about urban real estate. We're talking about rural real estate in an area of the world where prices have increased from 20 to 200 times more than the land with native forest in that region because of the demand for soybeans and cotton and corn, which have been occupying lots of areas in the Cerrado. It's an area that's fairly close to transport corridors. It's kind of flat. The soil structure is good. You can dump quite a lot of calcium and fertilizers on, and can make quite a lot of money. In fact, Brazil has become the world's major producer of soybeans and cotton and a few other products because of the basically because of the productivity of the Cerrado. So this is an area in which some people have been thinking, well, is it possible that you could avoid the clearance of significant areas of remaining vegetation in the Cerrado using some kind of strategy like payment for ecosystem services? And that's what Armando is asking about. Would it be possible uh, to convince what is called in Brazil grileiros? These are guys who are buying up pieces of land or stealing them and falsifying titles so that they can speculate with those lands and then make a killing in the real estate market. And the question is whether you can intervene in a market that is basically made up of criminals by using something as fancy as and as legally oriented as payment for ecosystem services. I kind of wonder about that myself, but it's possible that you find a payoff that could be more lucrative to the grileiro than speculating in falsified titles. I'd be very interested in going into that in more depth. I've been working with some people who have been spending a lot of their time talking about the problem of land speculation and what we call land grabbing these days is becoming quite a big issue, particularly by large multinationals uh, coming out of the north or coming out of China and investing in places where the lands are sort of relatively cheap when you're relating them, say, to the American Midwest, uh, or even a place like China where there's a lot of land available. Speculators are looking for opportunities to grab as much as land as possible, as cheaply as possible, to serve as the basis for substantial investment in food production in the future. This is it's probably one of the most significant tendencies in rural land use that is going on in the last. It's probably about the last decade has really been most significant. And in Brazil, we're seeing a lot of this, but it's also happening in Mozambique, We have had some of our colleagues in Brazil have been collaborating with their colleagues in Mozambique and looking at how this has happened there, where there's been a lot of land that has been taken up by Chinese investors to produce soybeans and other products, and this is causing negative externalities, as you can imagine, both environmentally and socially. It's displacing people who were producing subsistence crops on these lands, and then they're sort of shoved off and sent off to the cities or to other rural areas where they can't make as good a living. So this is quite a significant process that's going on. Now, whether we can get into a situation where that kind of speculation is occurring and convince people based on side payments or payments for a combination of uh, regulatory systems and payments of some kind to avoid reducing forests that are remaining in the areas that they are speculating in. That's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer for it. I think that in most cases, what we've been talking about in Brazil is not using payment for ecosystem services as a tool to compensate large landowners or speculators, but rather to compensate poor folks, Indians, and forest peoples who don't have other sources of income, that it would be worthwhile for them to help us serve as a bulwark against further deforestation than it would be to compensate grileros and other speculators. So I kind of wonder about this approach that Armando has in mind, but I'm sure he'll hit me with more discussion on this, because we've been debating these kinds of issues with him and others in the Brazilian Society for Ecological Economics for some time. Well, here we go. I guess that's the same one. Oh, here's another question from Rashida Attar. Is it true that some plants are now traveling to higher altitudes? Do you think that some plants benefit by higher carbon dioxide levels as claimed by some? Well, I just read in the paper today, actually, that beavers are moving north, and that is causing significant impacts on the pooling of water in the tundra in the frozen north. The once frozen north is now becoming the wet north. So because the beavers will dam up areas, rivers, and will enable the albedo effect, being what it is, will affect the attraction of the sun to heat up the area surrounding that and to melt the permafrost. So this is another feedback mechanism that is, I guess, surprising, that people weren't expecting might occur. This is, people always like beavers as being something more favorable for the environment, but in this case, we might be having a major conflict with overdose of beavers getting into the permafrost. Now, as far as other species are concerned, the species migration in search of better growing conditions is kind of a slower process, I think, than, say, animal migration, looking for better habitat. But it certainly is going to happen. It's going to be necessary to be growing crops at higher latitudes. I always sort of think that the Russians and the Canadians are the major beneficiaries of climate change, because they're areas that were not really viable for growing crops, growing food. Wheat is now going to become viable in Siberia. So Russia is going to become a breadbasket, and that may be good for Russia, but it's not great for other countries which are trying to compete as sources of grain. the United States itself, which has always been considered the world's breadbasket, and when it comes to overproduction of grain, is going to have more and more difficulty being adopting that role, and may have to buy grain from Canada. Other places like Mexico may become less viable than they have been over the last years because of the increasing temperatures and because of increasing rate of hurricanes that have been devastating areas of Mexico because of increased tempests affecting them. So I think it's really a significant issue. The whole issue of adaptation to climate change, I think, is probably the emerging science that people should really start focusing on much more than worrying so much about mitigation, because mitigation, I think, we've kind of butt up against a wall as far as mitigation potentials are concerned. They keep agreeing and disagreeing again about who should do what as far as mitigation of emissions is concerned, and that doesn't seem to be going anywhere very fast. So, although we have had some very positive results of Paris in 2015, we are seeing, with Trump and with the U.S. pulling out of Paris and not being really committed at a national level, at least, although we have some very advanced states doing very good things as far as that's concerned, California and New York and others. We don't have commitment at the federal level. And that sort of pulls a plug on a lot of what was being conceived as being the solution to mitigation for mitigation purposes. So we really need to be focusing a lot more on integrated mitigation and adaptation to climate change, and not only be thinking about mitigation, which has absorbed almost all of the attention up until now, and the resources available for adaptation are much less. I mean, we have the Global Climate Fund, the Green Climate Fund, which is modest. It was supposed to be quite a big show, but the amount of subscription to it has been very modest, and it's focused mostly on the countries that really don't have resources to adapt to climate change, like the small island states. But there's a lot of discussion about how you should be using these funds and which countries should be accessing them. Sometimes the money seems to be going for things it shouldn't. So there's always the discussion about how you implement policies that will effectively enable groups in society to adapt to a rapidly changing climate. And that is, I think, probably the biggest challenge that society faces, that humanity faces over the next decades. And I would very much recommend those of you who are interested in looking for a good topic for theses or for monographs or projects that you want to get involved in, that search for a good project in the adaptation area would be very, very suitable. Let's see if we got anything else here. What do you think have a bigger impact in changing private sector behavior regarding negative impacts and externalities? Consumer pressures or government regulation, negative incentives? Well, as I was saying, I think that the corporate sector has come a really long way in pulling forward on some of the more positive options toward process innovation and just trying to adopt a more sustainable strategy as to get them off of the wrong track. I think that this has been a fairly restricted in terms of the number of companies that have been involved. They're mostly large multinationals that have shown that they want to have a nice green image this way, and they have to be monitored. And so obviously there's a combination of consumer pressure, government and social monitoring and consumer monitoring that has to be built into the agreements by business coalitions and by finance coalitions that will make ensure that the results of this work are transparent and are available to those in society who are concerned about it. If it's all done in sort of, oh, we're going to do such and such, and then nobody knows whether it has actually happened, and we can actually point to specific changes that have occurred in corporate policies and corporate behavior, then it's, it really is greenwash. So we really have to think about ways to enforce more appropriately and more completely the energies of government, consumers, and the business coalitions themselves to the extent possible, self-monitor, but also to make that monitoring effort transparent so that we all have access to the information that is being generated and can question as need be what is actually being done. Here's another question from Armando. Do you know any research that calculated the financial loss related to loss of biodiversity, for example, that could be used for medicine and treatment of diseases? Well, that's always been a very contentious subject in the sustainability business because it's so difficult to estimate what you might lose in terms of potential discoveries, say for medicinal or say options that may arise for the use of, say, microalgae to absorb CO2. These ideas have been floated around, and but you need to have the genetic base. So it may be very important to ensure the survival of those biota that are the basis for innovations that will take place in the future in terms of medicinal potentials, in terms of avoiding risk from diseases that have not yet even been found to be problematic. Every year it seems we have a pandemic that pops out of nowhere and that nobody ever heard of. Zika, anybody knew what Zika was a few years ago? I never heard of it. It probably was around, but it wasn't anywhere near the level of intensity or problematic in terms of causing microencephaly and all these serious problems in children's development that we had as a result of that. And how are you going to avoid that these things happen in the future, or that you have the basis for responding to them in an adequate way if you don't have the genetic basis that is for like 80% of the world's pharmaceuticals are derived in some point from some kind of substance, some kind of molecule that's derived from nature. Everybody says, "Oh, we're going to synthesize everything, and everything's going to be possible to derive by chemical purposes, by chemical processes in the future." But we're still dependent on discovery of potential molecular activity from nature in a good number of cases, and have been more successful in finding drugs from shamans' knowledge than it has been possible from other means. So a lot of people in the pharmaceutical industry poo-poo this idea that you have to protect the Amazon because you might be able to cure cancer, 50 years from now. On the other hand, they don't really have that much success in finding cures for the most significant drugs for the most significant diseases that have been coming into play that are complete surprises and complete disasters for many people. So, this is obviously one source of importance, but I think that the valuation that has been done in economics of these benefits, of the potential benefits, has been very weak because of the probabilities involved and how much of a probability for finding a eventually important substance with molecular activity that could combat a yet unknown disease that you can expect from a hectare of the Amazon. This is a philosophical question, but it's at the same time, in terms of operationalizing valuation of the benefits of maintaining the Amazon intact for biodiversity reasons, that is one of the issues that has come up. And it's a real long shot. There have been heuristics that have been done that have tried to develop techniques to get at this kind of prediction, but it's not very solid science. So if that, for example, is one problem that I think that we're still in need of help on. And obviously, what we're talking about here is mainly what's called the option value associated with biodiversity. What kinds of options do we foreclose by deforesting the rest of the Amazon, or deforesting areas with high endemic populations of plants that have molecular activity that are important to stave off disease, and the option value and the existence value that are part of that valuation scheme that I showed you on the first day of this segment. They may be wishy-washy. They're basically derived from contingent valuation studies that we can go into at some point that can maybe be questioned. But on the other hand, they're what we have in terms of economic valuation techniques that can get at what people perceive to be the importance of the continued existence of tropical forests or whatever natural substances that may be derived in the future that would be of importance to humanity. So that's my shot at that question. Okay, I think we're nearing the end here. We have about 10 more minutes, and I don't see any other questions popping up. I would just I think to recapitulate, we've been talking a lot here today about valuation on the part of society, but also on the part of large businesses and of businesses that are exploiting and making use of nature, like the timber industry, and how much of a contribution they can make to a more sustainable future. And I think that that what we brought to bear in terms of understanding the restrictions against adequate valuation of these concerns, as well as the potential importance of having good cost estimates, both of what is the impact of policy and action, as well as the costs of actually implementing policy, are going to be very important for people to make decisions, both in government, in business, and in civil society, to thinking about how to move forward on making an impact positively toward a sustainable use and management of our terrestrial ecosystems. So that's my overall take on this discussion. I think it's been very, very fruitful. I don't see any other questions here, and I think we could just consider it a very valuable give and take, and hope to see you. I think I have another session coming up later on in the course, and maybe we'll have another opportunity for have Q&A in which I can also participate. But I appreciate your participation and the very incisive questions, and we look forward to more participation as we go forward in this course, which I think has been gathering quite a lot of interest throughout the world. Thank you very much.